America is in the hearts of those who died for freedom. It is also in the eyes of those who are building a new world. America is a prophecy of a new society of people. A prophecy of a system that knows no sorrow or strife or suffering. America is a warning to those who would try to falsify the ideals of the free. America is the nameless foreigner, the homeless refugee, the hungry boy begging for a job, and the black body dangling on a tree. America is the illiterate immigrant who is ashamed that the world of books and intellectual opportunities is closed to her. We are all that nameless foreigner, that homeless refugee, that hungry boy, that illiterate immigrant, and that lynched black body. All of us. All of us from the first Adams to the last Filipino.
All of us.
Native born or alien.
All of us.
Educated or illiterate. We are America.
So again, welcome everyone. Good day to those joining from wherever you are. My name is Jaime Giaga, and I'm here on behalf of the Friends of Echo Park Library and its Project Carlos Bulosan Book Club. Slide 2, please. This project was made possible with support from California Humanities, a nonprofit partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. And slide 3, please. Additional support was also provided by the following organizations. Thank you for your sponsorship. And now I'd like to turn the program over to Dr. Andre Luz.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning into our programming today, broadcasting from the Echo Park Branch Library in historic Filipino town in Los Angeles, California. Our program is called Bulosan on American Democracy, a hybrid arts and humanities project based on Carlos Bulosan's writings on American democracy. My name is Andres Luz, and I am the composer of the piece of music featured today. Along with me are an esteemed panel of speakers who will provide a historical, cultural, and social background situating the musical and literary content of the work, Bulosan on American Democracy, for narrator, Wind Symphony, and Fixed Media, which you will hear later in our lineup. We hope our program will furnish insightful and inspired content, aiming to appeal to both the hearts and minds of our viewers today. Now, many people do not know the name Carlos Bulosan and his important legacy as a labor rights activist and writer in California and Washington state history in the mid-20th century. Therefore, the aim of this program is to provoke interest in and pay homage to the contributions of the writer and activist, particularly in his defense of American democracy during a time when it was under threat from the rise of fascism in World War II Europe, authoritarian communism in the Soviet Union, and racism and xenophobia at home in the United States. It is a perspective which resonates with us today, considering the political climate and present state of the nation. As an overview of our program today, our first speaker, Dr. Jeffrey Cabusao, will provide a history of the generation of Filipino Americans who sought opportunity in the United States between 1920 to 1970, and they were known as the Manongs, or the brothers in the Ilocano dialect. Our second speaker is Peter Jamero, and Mr. Jamero is a social justice activist and a member of the Bridge generation. Born to Manongs, he will provide a valuable personal account of Manong life. Dr. Mary Lacanlale is our third speaker, and she will provide an account of the Philippine Constabulary Band, the premier wind ensemble staffed by Filipino military musicians who played in the 1939 Golden Gate Exposition in Northern California among their numerous visits to the United States. Following this, the recorded premiere of Bulosan on American Democracy at the University of Cincinnati will follow. And this performance was by the Wind Symphony of the University of Cincinnati, led by Kevin Holzman. Following that, we will have a Q and answer session, whereby we hope students joining us from the Sweetwater High School in the San Diego area will be forthcoming in a discussion with our panelists. So yes, and that class is taught by Mr. Eric Esperon. Thank you so much for having us. This program is fortunate to be sponsored by the Carlos Bulosan Book Club and the Friends of Echo Park Branch Library, a part of the Los Angeles County Library System. We are hosted by its treasurer, Jaime Geaga. Our first speaker today is Dr. Jeffrey Cabusao from Bryant University. Dr. Cabusao is professor of English and Cultural Studies in the Department of History, Literature, and Arts at Bryant University in Smithfield, Rhode Island. He is the editor of Writer in Exile, Writer in Revolt, Critical Perspectives on Carlos Bulosan, and a contributing editor to the Penguin Classics edition of Bulosan's America is in the Heart. Thank you, Jeffrey.
All right. Thank you so much, Andre, for that wonderful introduction. It's wonderful to join you today. I'm going to share my slides. However, it's telling me that host is disabled from sharing the screen. So if I could be able to share the screen, that would enable me to share my PowerPoint slides. So let me try again. Okay, thank you so much. And let me just pull up my slides here. Okay. All right. And again, it's really wonderful to be part of this terrific event to honor the contributions of Carlos Bulosan. Today, I'd like to address three questions in my brief presentation. One is, who is Carlos Bulosan? Why does Carlos Bulosan matter? And what can young people gain from reading Carlos Bulosan today? Carlos Bulosan was born of the Filipino farming class or peasantry in Binalonan, Pangasinan in 1911. He arrived in Seattle, Washington in 1930, and he died on September 11, 1956 in Seattle, Washington from pneumonia. When Bulosan arrived in Seattle, he joined 150,000 Filipino migrant workers. These are workers in the canneries of Alaska and on the plantations of the US West Coast and Hawaii. Here's an image of workers in the Alaskan canneries. And here are some iconic images of Filipino migrant workers on the US West Coast. We remember and honor Carlos Bulosan because he really is one of our first, or the first, major Filipino American writer. He was a prolific author of novels, short stories, essays, and poems. And Bulosan's unique consciousness as a writer draws on the interconnectedness of different identities. His racial identity, being a Filipino in America, his class identity, being a part of the working class, and his national origin. Bulosan was very, very proud of being a Filipino born and raised in the farming class of Philippine society. And here are some images of works published by Bulosan, works by Bulosan during his lifetime, but also works published posthumously after his death. The image to the right is a collection of short stories edited by the leading Bulosan scholar, Isan Juan Jr., The Philippines is in the Heart. Here's another novel, The Power of the People, and a collection of essays, short stories, and poems on becoming Filipino, both editions edited by Isan Juan Jr. Today, I'd like to focus on what is considered Bulosan's most famous work, America is in the Heart, which was originally published in 1946 and then republished in 1973 by the University of Washington Press as a response to the Asian American movement and the Philippine national sovereignty movement that reclaimed Bulosan in the 1970s, and then published again as a Penguin Classic in 2019. America is in the Heart is what we call an ethnobiography that is divided into 4 parts, 4 sections. It's unique because it blends different styles or different forms of writing, such as the Bildungsromans, or the coming-of-age novel, elements of naturalism, and elements of proletarian literature. We call America is in the Heart an ethnobiography because the main character, Alos, reflects the life of not only Carlos Bulosan, but also of the lived experiences of many, many Filipinos. Alos is a composite of many stories. He embodies the collective experiences of the Filipino farming class, the peasantry, in the Philippines under American colonial occupation, and the many Filipino migrant farm workers in the United States during the Great Depression of the 1930s. The structure of America's in the Heart traces the development of Alos's awareness of being on the margins of Philippine society and on the margins of US society. We follow Alos as he develops into a writer activist of the Filipino American labor movement, which includes the formation of the UCAPOA Union. UCAPOA stands for United Cannery, Agricultural Packing, and Allied Workers of America. Part 1 of America's in the Heart gives us insight into the experiences of the Filipino farming class under a system called absentee landlordism. So part 1 dramatizes how Alos's family falls apart and how they lose access, or they're dispossessed of their land under absentee landlordism, under American colonial occupation. Whenever I teach America's in the Heart, I have to remind my students that part 1 takes place in the Philippines under American colonial occupation. So after the Philippine American Philippines became a formal American colony until 1946. And here are some images representing some very disturbing images of how the Philippines was represented as subordinate to the United States. So in part one of America's in the Heart, again, we gain insight into what it was like to be part of the Philippine farming class under absentee landlordism. So here's one example. One summer day, when the rice lay golden in the sun, startling rumors came to Manguzmana. The peasants in a province to the south of us had revolted against their landlords. There, the peasants had been the victims of ruthless exploitation for years, dating back to the 18th century when Spanish colonizers instituted severe restrictive measures in order to impoverish the natives. So from then on, the peasants became poorer each year, and the landlords became richer at every harvest time. And the better part of it was that the landlord was always away, sometimes merely a name on a piece of paper. Asian American historian Erica Lee reminds us that U.S. colonial rule transformed the Philippine economy in ways that benefited American investors at the expense of the Filipinos, expanding the Philippines' export-oriented economy first established by the Spanish. Now, part two of America's in the Heart, we find Alos on his way to the United States as a steerage passenger. Part two gives us insight into the specificity of the Filipino experience in the United States. And this is an experience in which we see discrimination based on race and discrimination based on national origin. So a traumatic encounter with a young white girl on the boat's deck foreshadows Alos's life of fear and flight. This is a passage that's repeated over and over again in part two, a life of fear and flight in the United States, where he reconnects with his brothers Macario and Amado. Alos then later learns how to recreate family, community, and belonging through interracial working class solidarity. So here's a passage from part one that really demonstrates discrimination against Filipinos based on race and national origin at the same time. So this is what Alos hears while he's on his way to the United States. He hears a young white woman say, "Look at those half-naked savages from the Philippines. Haven't they any decency?" I was to hear that girl's voice in many ways afterward in the United States. It became no longer her voice, but an angry chorus shouting, "Why don't they ship those monkeys back where they came from?" Part two also gives us insight into the harsh conditions of the Filipino working class, what it was like to work in harsh conditions. Here's a passage from part two. In those days, labor unions were still unheard of in the canneries, so the contractors rapaciously exploited their workers. They had henchmen in every cannery who saw to it that every attempt at unionization was frustrated and the instigators of the idea punished. The companies also had their share in the exploitation. Our bunkhouses were unfit for human habitation. The lighting system was bad and dangerous to our eyes, and those working in the semi-darkness were severely affected by the strong ammonia from the machinery. I was working in a section called Washlai. One afternoon, a cutter above me working in the poor light slashed off his right arm with the cutting machine. It happened so swiftly he did not cry out. I saw his arm floating down the water among the fish heads. The openings of parts 3 and 4 are vastly different from the opening of part 2. They emphasize the development of the Filipino organic intellectual. Here we begin to see images of Alos consciously challenging racism and class exploitation, and Alos developing into a writer activist. Part 3 opens with the publication of The New Tide, which is a Filipino workers' literary magazine. And part 4 opens with Alos reflecting upon American models of the writer activist, such as Carrie McWilliams, Louis Adamic, and others. The narrative as a whole, however, reveals that Alos's ideal model of the writer activist is uniquely Filipino. It's a model rooted in what I like to call a global Filipino protest consciousness. This concept is embodied by the character of Felix Razon, whom Alos first encounters during his childhood in the Philippines in part 1. Felix Razon later reemerges within the story as an active participant, a writer-activist, in the Filipino labor movement in the United States at the end of part 2. So we're going to take a look at these two passages in part 1 and part 2. Here's Alos in part 1 in the Philippines. He says, "My mother and I went to the town of Tayog, a rich rice land, and helped in the harvest. Tayog and 2 other neighboring towns belonged to one family. In the middle of the season, strange men began coming to the rice fields. A rugged peasant boy made impassioned speeches to the harvesters. I remember this fanatical peasant boy because years afterward, I met him again in America. His name was Felix Razon." And then we fast forward to the end of part 2. Here's Alos again. "I took a bus for Los Angeles. I found that my brother Macario and Nick, Jose's brother, were living together. They had started a literary magazine, which is the New Tide, with a man named Felix Razon. To my amazement, he was the very same peasant boy who had warned me to leave the rice fields in Tayog before the Coloron revolted against the landlords." So why does Carlos Bulosan matter? America is in the Heart reminds us of the global movement of a Filipino protest consciousness that builds bridges between countries and builds bridges between generations. We see this in the character of Felix Razon, who functions as a bridge between the anti-colonial peasant revolts in the Philippines and the emergence of a Filipino-American labor movement in the United States. Bulosan's America's in the Heart also anticipates the bridge building between Filipino-American labor activism of the Manongs of the 1930s and the United Farm Workers movement of the 1960s. And we can see this embodied in the life and work of the Vice President of the United Farm Workers, Philip Veracruz, who taught the lessons of the Manong generation to young Filipino Americans in the 1960s. And that's the lesson of compassion, solidarity, and commitment. Asian American scholar, activist Glenn Umatsu states that Philip Veracruz had a larger moral vision, a compassion for all victims of oppression, solidarity with all fighting for liberation, and commitment to the ideals of democracy and social justice. We see this at the very end of America's in the Heart, where Alos begins to develop schools. He's using education as a vehicle for achieving social change. He creates worker schools to bring Filipino farm workers and Mexican farm workers together. He says, "I started a little worker school and invited the pea pickers. When I pointed out that the advance of democracy was related to the working man's struggle for better wages and living conditions, I felt a warm feeling of humanity growing inside of me." So here's Carlos Bulosan anticipating the emergence of the United Farm Workers movement in the 1960s. And here I'd like to share a very brief video. It's about a minute and a half that gives us an overview of the history of the United Farm Workers movement and the central role that the Filipino Manongs played in developing that movement.
The 2 big figures in the middle are Philip Veracruz and Larry Itliong. They were farm workers, but then became leaders in the farm worker movement, came together with Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta to form the United Farm Workers. But they already started organizing strikes for their basic rights to raise wages, around issues of actually being able to have access to restrooms, heat protections, things like that on the job. And then when they came together, approached Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta to join them to actually launch a grape strike in Delano. At that time, they said they weren't ready, but the Filipino Manongs said, you know what, this is a time we're gonna go ahead and do it anyways. So they went out, they struck, they were on a picket line, and then they were getting attacked by the owners who had hired armed guys to come and attack the picket lines. The Mexican farm workers saw that and like, we can't let our brothers actually go through this. So They then came together and decided to join the strike.
That's a less visible aspect of that history because most Americans, when they learn in history class, they learn about the strike, they learn that Cesar Chavez, and they don't learn about the Filipino workers who drove that action.
Yes, that's really true, and that's a big shame because it misses a lot of the lessons of what we learn, like how coming together makes us so much more powerful.
So I'd like to conclude by returning to my third question. What can young people gain from reading Carlos Bulosan today? And I'd like to say to young people in the audience, when you read the work of Carlos Bulosan, he gives us, and he'll give you the gift of literacy and the gift of historical memory. Literacy is basically the ability to read and write. And if Carlos Bulosan was alive today, he would encourage young Filipino Americans to really develop their reading skills, their writing skills, their love for learning, their love for reading. And here's a famous passage from Americas in the Heart where Alos discovers his ability to write, but also discovers that writing can be a very useful tool in fighting for social change. Alos states, "Then it came to me like a revelation that I could actually write understandable English. I was seized with happiness. I wrote slowly and boldly, drinking the wine when I stopped, laughing silently and crying. When the long letter was finished, a letter which was actually a story of my life, I jumped to my feet and shouted through my tears, 'They can't silence me anymore. I'll tell the world what they have done to me.'" And the second gift that young people will receive from reading Carlos Bulosan is the gift of historical memory, helping us to understand who we are as a people. And Carlos Bulosan was very interested throughout his life in using literature and art as an archive or repository of our collective memory as a people. Towards the end of his life, he was interested in doing this. He says in a letter to one of his associates, "I have a secret dream of writing a 1,500-page novel covering 35 years of Philippine history." He says, "I owe it to the Filipino people." So Carlos Bulosan's leading scholar, Isan Juan Jr., always says to young Filipino Americans to be proud of being Filipino because we have a very long history of struggle. As San Juan says, Filipinos continue to bear the marks of 3 centuries of anti-colonial insurgency. This is the process that we call the process of becoming Filipino. And it's a process that Bulosan reflected upon over and over again in his writings. So as Filipino Americans, we exist in a very sort of unique historical moment. Today, Filipinos are everywhere, nearly 12 million Filipinos around the globe. And I'd like to end with 2 questions for our young people today. 1, what does it mean to be Filipino? And 2, is there a difference between being Filipino and becoming Filipino? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Capusao. That was a wonderful, succinct, good lecture, introductory lecture on Carlos Bulosan. So our next speaker is Peter Jamero. Peter was born in 1930 in Oakdale, California, the eldest son of Filipino immigrants from Bohol, Philippines. Peter was raised on a Filipino farm worker camp operated by his parents in Livingston, California. After attending public schools, he spent 4 years with the U.S. Navy and saw duty in the Korean War. He married the former Terry Romero in 1953. Peter balanced raising a family with part-time work while attending college at San Jose State and UCLA, where he received a master's degree in 1957. He was a public affairs fellow at Stanford University in 1969/70. Despite not speaking English until the 1st grade and without the benefit of affirmative action programs yet to be enacted, he went on to trail to a trailblazing career as a top-level executive, directing multi-million-dollar health and human service programs in federal, state, and local government and in the private nonprofit sector. He also served as a faculty member at the Medical School of the University of Washington. He did not neglect his Filipino roots. He was the founding vice president and longtime board member of the Filipino American National Historical Society and was active with Peter credits whatever success he may have enjoyed in life and the hard work of his parents, the strong support from his wife, and the promise of a better future for his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Retired since 1995, Peter lives in Atwater, California. Peter wrote his life story in his book, Growing Up Brown, Memoirs of a Filipino American, published by the University of Washington Press in 2006. His second book is Vanishing Filipino Americans, The Bridge Generation, published by University Press in America in 2011. So now I'd like to give the floor to Peter. Peter, take it away.
Thank you, Jaime. You've been very kind in your introduction. And to everybody out there in Zoom land, greetings. Professor Cabasel spoke on Carlos Bulosan's belief in American democracy and its significance to Filipinos. Today, I will be talking about the impact of American democracy had on two Filipino generations, the Manong generation, Bulosan's generation, and the bridge generation of yours truly. The next slide, please. The Manong generation. Who were the Manong generation? They were young, single Filipino men who sailed halfway around the world to America via Hawaii to toil largely as farm workers in the early 1900s. Why did they come? Around the turn of the 20th century, Congress passed exclusionary legislation that ended Chinese and Japanese immigration to America. These were two groups that had been the primary source of labor in Hawaii. Plantation owners were desperate for additional workers to harvest their sugarcane crops. They convinced Congress to streamline the immigration process to expedite workers from the Philippines, then a colony of the United States. Plantation recruiters, more interested in attracting workers at the lowest cost, spoke glowingly of high-paying jobs in beautiful Hawaii. They also only targeted single men with minimal education from the Ilocos and Visayas, regions in the Philippines with a history of being accustomed to hard work. Thousands of Filipinos sailed to Hawaii, especially during the 1920s and 1930s, all eager to work. But upon their arrival, they found that the promises of good wages and living conditions often did not materialize. The workers became visibly upset, but ultimately realized they had little choice but to work in a strange land. Fearful the workers might become recalcitrant or rebellious, plantation owners employed brutal field supervisors to control the workers. They had a second control tactic. They pitted one group over the other, Filipinos against the Japanese, Ilocanos against the Saiyans, Japanese against the Chinese, and so on. But eventually, the various groups figured out they were being used and went on strike throughout Hawaii. Plantation owners blamed Filipinos for the strikes and blackballed them from further work in Hawaii. Next slide, please. With no jobs, Filipino workers sailed to mainland America. But the workers found that conditions were no better there. In many ways, it was worse. They found that work in America was seasonal. They found that crops were varied. Filipino workers then had to travel miles and miles to work. For example, they might cut asparagus in the spring, travel in the summer to the Central Valley to pick grapes, or to Alaska to work in the salmon canneries, go to the coast in the fall to harvest lettuce. Then the cycle would begin again. The Manong generation became a generation of migratory workers. But their situation would get worse. The 1929 Great Depression came along. White Americans resented Filipinos for taking scarce jobs away from them. White Americans also resented the young single Filipino workers for being attracted to white women. Discrimination and violence became rampant. White mobs routinely chased Filipinos out of town. A worker was murdered and a residential facility was bombed. No Filipino signs were commonplace. Next slide, please. The bridge generation you will see here is defined as children born in America by the end of 1945 to at least one Filipino parent who immigrated to the United States during the early 1900s. That may be a long definition, but I think if you look at the disparate parts, you will see that it covers a lot of the experiences that Professor Cabasao spoke of and that I mentioned earlier today. The bridge generation are the children of the Manong generation. Most of the bridge generation have passed away. Today, those who remain are in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. We are a rapidly vanishing generation. We are also a mixed generation because of America's early policy of recruiting only single Filipino men. We were raised in our father's Filipino culture, but we rejected our parents' regional prejudices and their colonial mentality that whites were superior. We had little interest in events in the Philippines or even in sabong, cockfights, which is the Philippines' national sport. Like the Manong generation, we also experienced discrimination in jobs, housing, and education. But there was a major difference. The Manong generation only experienced discrimination as adults. The bridge generation were discriminated against when we were kids. On the other hand, we follow the values and customs of our Filipino parents. We refer to elders as Manong and Manang, or uncle and auntie, or lolo or lola, but never, never by their first names. We ate rice with our meals, and we loved adobo. We developed our own subculture because we were often overlooked. We organized our own youth clubs. And because establishment Filipino organizations were often suspicious of our youth clubs, we had to learn how to raise money for activities. And we even conducted our meetings according to Robert's Rules of Order. We called ourselves flips, but did not allow others to use the term. We talked in G language, based on Pig Latin that was then popular. We invented the offbeat to dance to bebop music. In summary, while we developed our own subculture, we also retained our Filipino-ness. We were not just proud Filipinos. We considered ourselves as proud Filipino Americans. Next slide, please. As I conclude this morning, I just want to say that despite the Manong generation's horrible treatment in America, Carlos Bulosan's writings are a testament to American democracy. He wrote it to inspire and remember the Manong generation. I believe he wrote it to document their experiences for all Americans to read. I also would like to believe he wrote it to inspire his generation's children, the bridge generation. In closing, I want to leave you with one question. Is Carlos Bulosan's belief in American democracy relevant today? Thank you for your kind attention.
All right, thank you, Peter and Jeffrey, for that very detailed very detailed historical and literary analysis. Let me bring our third speaker up for the lineup. That is Dr. Mary Tolusan Lacanlale. She is an associate professor and chair of Asian Pacific Studies at California State University, Dominguez Hills. She has a PhD in ethnomusicology from UCLA, and she is the author of Instruments of Empire, Filipino Musicians, Black Soldiers, and Military Band Music During the U.S. Colonization of the Philippines, published by the University Press of Mississippi and the Filipinos in Greater Boston from Arcadia Press. Dr. Lacanlale is the co-editor of Our Culture Resounds, Our Future Reveals, A History of Filipino-American Performance in California, available from Ube Arte. She performs Philippine Kulintang gong music with the Pakaragurian Kulintang Ensemble. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you so much, Andres, for that gracious introduction. And thank you to all the sponsors that brought us here today for this important talk. I'm just going to start sharing my slides with you. Great. So the topic of my talk today is the Philippine Constabulary Band. which visited the Filipino communities of Stockton and Oakland, California in 1939 during the Golden Gate International Exposition, a time in which Carlos Bulosan was alive. I'm going to make 2 points in my talk. One is to ask the question, how do Filipino communities in the United States interact with the Philippines and the culture from the Philippines? This is going to be evident in the ways that the Filipino communities of Stockton and Oakland invited the Philippine Constabulary Band to visit them and perform a concert when they were here for the Golden Gate Exposition. As Andreas mentioned, I wrote Instruments of Empire, published just a couple of years ago. And one of the things that inspired me to write this book was that my great-grandfather was actually in this band, which came to the United States from the Philippines in 1904, 1909, 1915, and of course in 1939. They actually went to several World's Fairs, including the infamous 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, in which for the first time, the American public was able to see Filipinos face to face in live. And so 1,100 Filipinos from all over the Philippines were brought to the 1904 World's Fair, including the Philippine Constabulary Band. So who was the Philippine Constabulary Band? Well, the men in the band were soldiers of the Philippine Constabulary, and almost all of them, like my great-grandfather, had been training in music since a very young age. My great-grandfather started learning music formally in Spanish convents since the age of 8 years old, when his mother brought him to the Spanish convent and left him there. And he not only learned how to play several instruments, but he also learned to read and compose music. This is going to be important in a little while, but this was the profile of many of the members of the band. In 1904, they were one of the largest military bands, not only in the Philippines, but in the world. There were over 83 members. And quite remarkably, their founder and first conductor was Walter H. Loving, who was actually an African-American officer who went to the Philippines during the Spanish-American War. And he founded this band and auditioned all of these wonderful Filipino musicians to be in it. He was actually the conductor until 1939, when he brought the Philippine Constabulary Band to San Francisco, and he actually died in the Philippines during World War II. But briefly, I'm sure you're wondering, what did they sound like? And I just want to play a brief clip of you, a very rare recording of them from 1910. And it's going to sound a little scratchy because it was recorded on a cylinder, and this was before records. Okay, so they were so well sought out and acclaimed throughout the United States that they traveled to places like Symphony Hall in Boston, to New York, to Chicago, Washington, D.C. They played all over the United States. And one of the reasons that the United States colonial government brought them so many times was to show the American public that Filipinos were wonderful musicians, but also that they were capable of reaching a level of civilization and European classical music was one of those sort of markers of what civilization looks like. So why was it so important to emphasize that? Well, as you heard from the other two speakers, Filipinos were up against terrible stereotypes that cast them as savages or semi-civilized or not quite capable of reaching what the world thought of as civilization, which is European civilization. And so the Philippine Constabulary Band played mostly European and American concert music, but they also did some things to emphasize their Filipino heritage. Uh, the piece that I performed for you, played for you just a second ago, was La Sampiguita by a Filipino composer. So they found ways to emphasize their Filipino heritage and to make sure that the American public knew that Filipinos were quite capable of reaching the markers of civilization. So this is a photograph of Lieutenant Colonel Walter H. Loving in 1939. He was, as I said, the founder and conductor of the PC band, and he was actually from Virginia, studied in Washington, D.C., but in 1939, he actually settled in Oakland, California. So not only did the Oakland Filipino community notice that the Philippine Constabulary Band was coming, but also that Walter Loving was one of them from that community. And so it was really, really a moment that was full of pride for Filipinos living here in the US. As the other speakers mentioned earlier, there were numerous stereotypes, racism, and violence towards Filipinos at that time. And so for a brief moment here at the 1939 Golden Gate World Exposition, Filipinos could portray something that they were deeply proud in, which was the musical accomplishment of this Philippine Constabulary Band. To resist the stereotypes of Filipinos as semi-civilized, as inferior, they actually highlighted soloists. And this was done deliberately to show that Filipinos had individuality, that they had character. And this aligns really very well with what Carlos Bulosan talks about in democracy, meritocracy, and pride in reaching your very best. So they put forth Filipino soloists in all of their concerts, because one of the things that American newspapers would often say was that Colonel Loving just picked a bunch of random men because Filipinos are so musical. It doesn't matter who you pick. They could all be great musicians. Well, that was a terrible misunderstanding, a terrible injustice to Filipino capability, because as I said, people like my great-grandfather, who's actually here in this photo, Pedro Navarro, they studied European music from a very young age, and to cast them as those naturally gifted Filipinos, you could pick any at random, they'll all be good. That wasn't true at all. In fact, it's a stereotype that still persists. And even though it sounds like a positive stereotype, it is still a stereotype that really takes away attention from our individuality and our hard work and our capability as musicians and as people. Just to show you that the Philippine Constabulary Band was known to all of the great musical conductors. This is perhaps the very most famous one at the time, John Philip Sousa. He said the Philippine Constabulary Band of 80 native musicians has furnished the musical sensation of the World's Fair, being pronounced by John Philip Sousa as the most wonderful military band he ever listened to. And while they were so highly acclaimed during this time, it's such a shame that we don't know their name today. And that's part of the reason that I wrote the book. So here they are in 1909, Boston Symphony Hall. I myself am from Boston and have played in this hall. And so to find out that Filipinos were there in 1909, including my great-grandfather, was such a point of pride for me as a young person. So in 1939, this is a photo of the Philippine Pavilion at the Golden Gate International Exposition, Treasure Island, and here is the full band in front of this pavilion. By 1939, they were very well known throughout the world. And so again, the Filipino communities of Stockton and Oakland had great pride in bringing them to their communities to play, especially for them. A number of these people from those communities had been going to the Golden Gate Exposition, but it was an enormous amount of organization to bring them to their communities specifically. So who were the people of the Oakland and Stockton communities? You can look at, read the late scholar Don Mabalan's wonderful book, Little Manila is in the Heart. Again, the title is hearkening back to and inspired by Carlos Bulosan's America's in the Heart. Some of them were former pensionados. Pensionados came in the early 1900s, right before the generation of agricultural workers came in the late 20s and early 30s. They went to universities in the United States, including the ones we know today, Berkeley, USC, Harvard. And so some of them did settle and form communities here. And this is a wonderful book looking at those communities. But those pensionados in 1939 got together and brought the Philippine Constabulary Band to their communities specifically to play for them. And this is not easy. It costs a lot of money, but we can see that through this effort, it was very important for the communities in the U.S. to connect with this famous Filipino band. And so from this article here, from the Lodi News Centennial in Stockton, advertised that the Philippine Constabulary Band was going to play a program for them, but it would actually be different from what they were playing at the Golden Gate Exposition. So this is a special music program just for them. Filipinos could not only play the military band music. As I said, my great-grandfather played numerous instruments. And so the Philippine Constabulary Band actually switched to be a symphony orchestra. So they played stringed instruments, violin, viola, cello, bass, and so on. And so their tremendous talent at music unfortunately played into the stereotypes that all Filipinos were naturally musical. In fact, this stereotype pervaded the minds of so many great bandmasters that at the 1939 exposition, they said, we don't believe those Filipinos can actually play music. They're just mimicking music. They thought they just learned everything by ear and memorized it and mimicked music. So one of the bandmasters said, I want to hear this band sight read. To sight read music, it means that you've never seen this piece before and you suddenly have to play it well in front of an audience. So the Philippine Constabulary Band did that. They could read and write music. And so they showed the audiences at the Golden Gate International Exposition and the bandmasters that they could read music. Just because they memorized them doesn't mean they couldn't read them. They were multiply talented. And so this is what cultivated a sense of pride in the Filipino communities of Stockton and Oakland. Here, it's kind of a grainy photograph and newspaper, but this is the Philippine News, published in Oakland, California, May 1939. After the performance of the Philippine Constabulary Band, they held a banquet dinner for them at a local restaurant owned by Filipinos, and really brought together the leaders in the community to meet the Lovings, Colonel Loving and his wife, and to connect with them, the Filipino communities, with this Philippine organization. So it was really, really important in a sense of pride for them. So what I want you to think about as I conclude is, what do you think about visiting artists or group from the Philippines? Do you sense feel a sense of pride in their recognition and accomplishment? And how do you maintain connections, not only with your Filipino American culture, but also with your roots in the Philippines? So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary, for a
Thank
wonderful
you.
presentation. And at this point, I would like to introduce Dr. Andre Luz. Andre is a composer of both acoustic and electronic media, inspired by musical styles drawing from the entire gamut of music history and the Renaissance up until today's contemporary postmodernism. In addition to teaching music technology during his graduate years at the University of Georgia, he was also the visiting assistant professor of music theory and electronics at the University of Redlands, located here in the greater Los Angeles area. He frequently draws upon Filipinx and Filipinx American source materials to inform his works, including the pieces we are to examine today, Bulosan on American Democracy, Grand Passacaglia for Narrator, Wind Symphony, and Fixed Media. This work was his doctoral dissertation project from the University of Georgia, began in 2019 and completed in 2021, with further revisions in 2023. In March 2021, the piece was selected among dozens of international submissions for the Ablaze Records call for works for its anticipated first volume release in the Wind Orchestra Masters series, expected this spring-summer in 2024. Days before the premiere performance at the University of Cincinnati, days before the premiere performance at the University of Cincinnati on Lucky Friday the 13th in October of last year, Bulosan on American Democracy won the 2023 American Prize in Composition, University Level Wind Ensemble Division, as well as second prize in the Social Justice category, University Level Division. Now I present to you Dr. Luz.
Hello, all. Thank you for tuning in today, and thank you for that very interesting lecture, Mary. I look forward to learning more about the Philippine Constabulary Band for sure. Now, with regards to the background of the composition, Bulosan on American Democracy was my dissertation composition project at the University of Georgia, and the work draws inspiration from two important literary works by Carlos Bulosan. The first is the semi-autobiographical novel America is in the Heart from 1946, and the essay Freedom from Want from 1943. Now, Bulosan believed that in order for American democracy to remain intact at a time when it was under the threat by global fascism in Western Europe and during World War II, authoritarian communism in the Soviet Union, and racism at home, the nation must seek to provide a thriving, independent, and well-educated populace situated in a culture that values natural rights and defends intellectual and artistic freedoms for all. Despite the rampant racism, xenophobia, class discrimination, harassment, and violence during his time, Bulosan steadfastly believed in the American values of liberty, opportunity, and excellence, even in the face of the abject poverty, poor working conditions, and marginalization which he and his colleagues had experienced in the United States. Now, admittedly, this music, if you're new especially, is challenging, and there are many ways to examine it, but I think that it is first and foremost expressive. For listeners new to this music, I find the best approach is to relate Bulosan's inspiring words with the emotional spirit of the music that accompanies it. The music's emotional content will be the most immediate quality that you will perceive as the words are delivered. There will be interpretive notes included in the video to help provide you with some insight in real time. But this expression aims to appeal to both the mind and the heart as it communicates its message across to its audiences. In fact, there's a slide I'd like to show you, a quote by Victor Hugo. I need to open my... he said, this famous author said, music expresses that which cannot be said and on which it is impossible to be silent, meaning that whereas words will speak for themselves in conveying their meaning, music helps to convey the meaning in ways that cannot be verbalized, but yet are important to communicate the emotional spirit that are behind the words. So my question to the general audience and to any students that are in the room, this is a very there are musical elements here that point to both kindness and cruelty. The kindness and cruelty that Carlos Bulosan and his colleagues had faced in this country. So this kindness and cruelty evoke the American paradox, where the idealism of the nation hopes to, aims for equality and opportunity for all, despite where you come from, what you believe in, and all these other freedoms. But yet Carlos Bulosan and his colleagues also faced a lot of resistance, racial resistance, and systematic resistance, which held them back. And by extension, this includes many other groups that are around today, of course. And this is the challenge of democracy and our nation. So in the very beginning of this music, you will hear two distinct sounds, musical ideas. One, which is kindness, which sounds like sort of a melody that aspires to be something and is very hopeful, followed by something very different, loud, dissonant sonorities, clashing sonorities that aim to rattle you. And this stands for cruelty. This musical work is a journey, all in all, from darkness to light and from conflict to resolution. And the question is, how does this music convey kindness and cruelty as the thoughts evolve, as the narrator moves from one idea to another? How does the music move from darkness to light? There are captions provided in the video that will help you sort of distinguish section from section, and some analysis on some of the symbolism. And it lasts 27 minutes, so we'll see you on the other side.
Was America so kind and yet so cruel? take democracy for granted. We feel it grow in our working together, many millions of us working toward a common purpose. If it took us several decades of sacrifices to arrive at this faith, it is because it took us that long to know what part of America is ours. Our faith has been shaken many times, and now it is put to question. Our faith is a living thing, and it can be crippled or chained. It can be killed by denying us enough food or clothing, by blasting away our personalities and keeping us in constant fear. Unless we are properly prepared, the powers of darkness will have good reason to catch us unaware. And trample our lives. Why was America so kind and yet so cruel? must live in America where there is freedom for all, regardless of color, station, and beliefs. We must be united in the effort to make an America in which our people can find happiness. It is a great wrong that anyone in America, whether they be brown or white, should be illiterate or hungry or miserable. The totalitarian nations hate democracy. They hate us because we ask for a definite guarantee. A guarantee of freedom of religion. Freedom of expression. And freedom from fear and want. Our challenge to tyranny is the depth of our faith in a democracy worth defending. Although they spread lies about us, the way of life we cherish is not dead. The American dream is only hidden away, and it will push its way up and grow again. The American dream is only hidden away. The American dream will push its way up. The American dream will grow again. We have moved down the years steadily toward the practice of democracy. We become animate in the growth of Kansas wheat, or in the ring of Mississippi rain. We tremble in the strong winds of the Great Lakes. We cut timbers in Oregon, just as the gold flowers blossom in Maine. We are multitudes in Pennsylvania mines, in Alaskan canneries. We are millions from Puget Sound to Florida. are all Americans that have toiled and suffered and known oppression and defeat. From the first Native American that offered peace in Manhattan to the last Filipino pea pickers. America is not bound by geographical latitudes. America is not merely a land or an institution. America is in the hearts of those who died for freedom. It is also in the eyes of those who are building a new world. America is a prophecy of a new society of people. A prophecy of a system that knows no sorrow or strife or suffering. America is a warning to those who would try to falsify the ideals of the free. America is the nameless foreigner, the homeless refugee, the hungry boy begging for a job, and the black body dangling from a tree. America is the illiterate immigrant who is ashamed that the world of books and intellectual opportunities is closed to her. We are all that nameless foreigner, that homeless refugee, that hungry boy, that illiterate immigrant, and that lynched black body. All of us from the first Adams to the last Filipino. Native born or alien, educated or illiterate, we are America. If you want to know what we are, look at those reading books, searching in the dark pages of history for the last word, the key to the mystery of the living peace. We are factory hands, field hands, mill hands, searching, building, and molding structures. We are doctors, scientists, chemists, discovering and eliminating disease, hunger, and antagonism. We are soldiers and citizens guarding the imperishable dreams of our ancestors. To live in freedom. We are the living dream of the dead. We are the living spirit of the free. We are America.
All right, that was great. Thank you. Sorry, apologies to our audience for the choppy video feed. You never know what will happen when technology is involved, right? But I want to add a few things here that I didn't add the first time we offered this presentation last Saturday, just a little bit more insight. You may have noticed, oh, by the way, before I move to that, the video of the full concert presentation, as you've just seen, will be available later in a different cut. Eventually, this presentation will be moved over to YouTube, where it will live indefinitely for any future viewers or for anyone who wants to watch our presentations. Again, the video of this performance will be available later because we're anticipating the release of the commercial recording, which should happen around spring or summer this year, if not sooner. Even though we didn't see the entire presentation fully, it'll be available later on YouTube, and I will likely email everyone who registered for the function to give them some news. Some additional insight. You may have noticed that the 26th variation was entitled Chapter 49, Bells and Faith. And let me read to you why that's so. I'll read to you the very last chapter. It's a short one, of America's in the Heart, to provide you some justification why that variation is entitled as such. This is the last chapter of America's in the Heart. The next morning, I put my brother Macario's money in the bank in his name, and I went to the bus station. I wanted to catch the last crew of cannery workers in Portland. I looked out of the bus window. I wanted to shout goodbye to the Filipino pea pickers in the fields who stopped working when the bus came into view. How many times in the past had I done just that? They looked toward the highway and raised their hands. One of them, who looked like my brother Amado, took off his hat. The wind played in his hair. There was a sweet fragrance in the air. Then I heard the bells ringing from the hills, like the bells that had tolled in the church when I had left Binalonan. I glanced out of the window again to look at the broad land I had dreamed so much about, only to discover with astonishment that the American earth was like a huge heart unfolding warmly to receive me. I felt it spreading through my being, warming me with its glowing reality. It came to me that no man, no one at all, could destroy my faith in America again. It was something that had grown out of my defeats and successes, something shaped by my struggles for a place in this vast land, digging my hands into the rich soil here and there, catching a freight to the north and to the south, seeking free meals in dingy gambling houses, reading a book that opened worlds of heroic thoughts. It was something that grew out of the sacrifices and loneliness of my friends, of my brothers in America and my family in the Philippines, something that grew out of our desire to know America and to become part of her great tradition and to contribute something toward her final fulfillment. I knew no man could destroy my faith in America that had sprung from all our hopes and aspirations ever. So, it's moving stuff. And I wanted to memorialize that chapter in this very last variation, whereby the kindness idea is revealed to be the last strain of the Star Spangled Banner. There's a video on my YouTube which explains how I changed that bit of the Star Spangled Banner into the kindness idea, and then it to reveal itself at this very end in variation 26 to be the exact idea that we had been greeted with at the very beginning, as if to mean that democracy has always been with us since the beginning of this nation. And perhaps it just took all this reflection, all this time, before we can finally realize the worth of democracy and its meaning for us. And so that is one of the main meanings that's hidden, the symbolism hidden in this work. In my mind, this is a work of epiphany above all, and transformation. So let me at this point open up the question and answer
The Q&A.
Q&A session.
Yeah.
Let me introduce Jaime Giaga,
Oh.
our moderator. Jaime is currently a board member and treasurer of the Friends of Echo Park Library. He established the Carlos Bulosan Book Club in 2017, which is a project of the Friends Group. Jaime's background was in the field of public health, dealing with the HIV and AIDS crisis from the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s. Today, he spends most of his time with the Echo Park Library Friends Group and is involved with the community activities in the historic Filipino town community, also known as Hi-Fi. Lastly, he serves as a commissioner for the LA City Central Area Planning
Thank you,
Commission.
Andre. I think for this session, I would like to have those who have joined as attendees to actually, if Caroline, our Zoom tech, I'd like the audience to go. I'd like to have this Q&A be a conversation. So, if you could raise your hands, and then we will spotlight you. Then you can make your comment or ask the question to the panelists. So let's try. We planned for a larger attendance, and so we wanted to restrict the Q&A to the Q&A box. But I think we can handle the number of people attending this webinar. So I open up to you. Raise your hands. We'll look for you. We'll spotlight you, and we'll unmute you, and you can share your question or comments to the whole panelist. So we're looking. Those of you or panel, if you see anybody's hands raised or Caroline in the background, so we'll give you.
Actually, a viewer had posted something in the chat and wanted to know if the PC band, the Philippine commissary band, still plays or still exists today in some fashion. And I think Mary had an answer.
Yes, the Philippine Constabulary Band ended when the Philippines gained independence because they transitioned to the Philippine Army Band. So this is, instead of being the Philippine Constabulary under the colonial government, it was now the Philippine Army Band, and the Philippine Army Band still exists today.
Great. And Ms. Van Ginkel also wanted to know, is there any kind of database of current Filipino music groups and where they are located if we wanted to try and support any local ones in our areas?
Oh, gosh, that's a wonderful question. And thank you for thinking of supporting all the groups. In my book, Our Culture Resounds, Our Future Reveals, we highlight a number of groups in Southern California, also some in Northern California, but you can download that book as a free ebook. Just go to ubearte.org and you can download it there. It's wonderful because it has live links. When you click on the PDF, it'll bring you to videos and links that are in the book. And so there's a number of groups that are featured. Pakaragian Kulintang Ensemble is a group I perform with, but there's also Malaya Filipino American Dance Arts. There's also Samahan Filipino dance organization in San Diego. And there's several that are featured there. So thank you for asking that.
And one more, I think you also mentioned of pre-World War Philippine Constabulary Band recordings by
Yes.
Fred Stone.
Oh, yes, there's very few recordings of the pre-war, pre-1945 Philippine Constabulary Band, but two of them exist and they're available. If you go to UCSB's website, there's 2 cylinders there of the Philippine Constabulary Band. One is The Belle of the Philippines, which was written by Fred Stone, who's actually an African-Canadian composer. And of course, La Sampaguita that I played earlier by a Filipino composer.
Great, great. Thank you.
So we have a question from Miss Ginkel, Van Ginkel. I think if you unmute yourself, you can go ahead and ask the question. Do you hear us? You're unmuted. Now you can, yeah, you're unmuted. So go ahead, please.
I don't know if you can hear me. I'm not sure exactly where the microphone is.
We can hear
me
you. We can hear
okay?
you.
One of my students would like to know how long it took Mr. or Dr. Luz to compose the piece we were just listening to.
Oh man. So I would say between 2019 and then off and on all the way up to 2021 with further revisions. So however you maybe a good portion of 2-3 years off and on with further revisions. Some more insight, originally the sequences that had the Capitol insurrection were not thought of until later. I remember I was over in Georgia in, for academic year 2020 to 2021. And I came home one day on January 6th, 2021, very surprised after teaching a section of music technology to find that there was a lot of news happening around midday and nothing I would have predicted. And that insurrection was to haunt me for a good few months. And I decided to musically depict it later on as an afterthought, because as you know, I'm no expert on government, but I do know that if you boil down what fascism is, it's essentially two pillars, one of authoritarianism and one of racism, or any kind of thought that precludes other groups based upon some identity marker, in this case race. So if you have those two ingredients, you have the very basics of what constitutes fascism. And so there are two antitheses in the composition, one which depicts the Watsonville riots, which you can compare with the Charlottesville marches, and then later, which is the sort of racist arc, and later on in the composition, where you have the rise of fascism in World War II Europe, coupled with the Capitol insurrection, which is the arc of authoritarianism. So I depict those two ingredients as we mire through Bulosan's contemplation of democracy. You have to also deal with the specter of fascism. It happened in his day. We see elements of it happening in ours, and so it provides just more meaning. And these two things help to sort of complicate but also enrich the composition. So it took a long time, but I think it's worth it because it makes a big statement. So
Okay, we do have a question. So I've promoted Mario to a panelist. So you can turn on your video and unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question, please. Mario, are you here? Mario there.
Hello.
Okay, we hear you.
This is for Dr. Mary Toulouse. Have you been in connection with any of the other relatives from the CB, and how do they feel about your work?
Oh, great question. Thank you for asking. I did contact several people who are descendants of the pre-World War II Philippine Constabulary Band. In fact, if you've heard of the Filipino-American Symphony Orchestra that's based here in Los Angeles, Robert Schroeder, who's the founder and conductor, his father was a former member of the band. Captain Fresnito's son, Virgilio, who's in his 90s. I also interviewed him for my book, and several other people who contacted me through a Facebook group called Philippine Constabulary Band 1904, that they are also descendants. And lastly, I contacted the descendants of Walter Loving and interviewed them as well. And there's even a photo of his granddaughter in my book. So they were very excited about it, largely because the PC band is so unknown at our time, and they really deserve recognition for being not only a fantastic military band, but several of them were composers and also influenced military band music all over Asia. They became the founders of groups in other Asian countries, Indonesia, Hong Kong. There's other scholars who cover that work, but it's really exciting that that I hope to create like a renewed interest in this band. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you. We're about 10 to 1. Maybe we can entertain one or two more questions and see if we have anybody post a question on the chat. Then we can panelists help me with seeing if there's anybody we can identify the attendee, the guest, and allow them to talk and ask their question or make a comment. Any takers? So there's a raised hand here from Miss Van Ginkle again. Let me see here, Miss Van Ginkle. So I think, yeah, you can talk. Go ahead.
Another one of my students wants to know, why does it take so long to be able to write a piece of music?
Yeah. Well, everyone works at a different rate. I certainly am not a sprinter. I take a long time and I refine a lot. So, I was working on other things too. I was also teaching for a little bit and revisions and, commitments I have to live up to. Every composer will have a different answer. So, yeah. And so many instruments. I mean, what do we have in the video you saw? You had maybe 40. So all the gray hairs you see in my hair now, those weren't there before my thesis. So yeah, it took a while. But some people will turn something out very quickly, depending upon what it is or they're working on. So
Thank you for that. Maybe we can have one more, and then I will follow it with maybe 1 minute closing remarks from our panelists. But do you see anybody's raised hands or comments? So I think with that, maybe we could start. I could start with Professor Kabasal, then Mary, then Peter, and then we'll end with Andre, and then I'll close everything off. Any last comments, last words, closing remarks, Professor Kabasal?
Sure. Thank you so much, Jaime. And again, it's really wonderful to be a part of the panel and to hear from my colleagues and to hear again to watch Andre's really compelling piece. And what I think spoke to me was the way in which Andre juxtaposes fascist violence that Bulosan writes about in Americas in the Heart, and the emergence of fascist violence in our contemporary society, that paradox of America being kind and cruel. And in Bulosan's text, America's in the Heart, as Jaime can attest to in their reading of Bulosan, that the kindness that Bulosan encounters is really the kindness of interracial working class solidarity. So it's embodied through various characters like the Odell sisters, who are actually the Bab sisters who nurtured Bulosan's development. And in the text, he would always say, what is the common denominator that brings us together, that can challenge the cruelty of America? And the common denominator, that bridge, was class. So when Bulosan wrote America's in the Heart, that was in the midst of incredible mass movements for change. I mean, his contemporary was Billie Holiday, Richard Wright, John Steinbeck, even Frank Sinatra's "The House I Live In" speaks to that kind of vision of a multiracial working class America. So for Bulosan, if the common denominator was class to bridge all those different movements to create a mass movement, I think that's the same question we should ask today with the rise of fascism in our society. We have so many different movements, the movement against anti-Asian violence, the movement for Black Lives Matter, the movement for the environmental justice in our world. What is the common denominator that can bring all these movements together to create a mass movement to push against the fascist violence that we bear witness to today?
Thank you. Thank you. Mary, any closing remarks?
Yeah, thank you so much. This discussion and the panelists and the music has just been so rich. And I'll sort of summarize with my perspective on how music plays a role in bringing visibility and attention to Filipino Americans, not just their plight and their struggles, but really their capabilities and their successes. You're right, during the 1930s and beyond, Filipino Americans and people from the Philippines have struggled so much to have to resist the kind of stereotypes and subtle and overt forms of racism that we face. And when I think of Carlos Bulosan and also this Philippine Constabulary Band, the kind of success and excellence they wanted to bring attention to Filipino and Filipino Americans as highly creative and individualistic and worthy of the kind of attention and recognition in this country, but also worldwide. And I think Carlos Bulosan is just supremely inspiring for that. And I would encourage the young people and all of the people listening today to think of yourselves as a person in a historical time period that has something to say. Carlos Bulosan, we know, didn't start out as a famous writer. He came from very from struggling means and struggled when he was here. But when he thought of himself and recognized himself as having a voice and was living in a particular moment in history and decided to document that, I think that's really, really important. I'm sure people like my great-grandfather who toured the United States, they didn't necessarily think of writing their stories down, which is why I didn't have his diaries to use in my book, but to document ourselves and our time and our successes. So thank you.
Thank you for that. Peter, I'm asking you to unmute. Hopefully you can find your unmute.
Am I on?
mic. Yeah, you are. Thank you. So your closing remarks for a minute.
Several things. First of all, at 93 years of age, I thought I've experienced everything, but this is one of a kind. I never dreamed that I would be able to talk about things that I'm interested in with a symphony music that also reflects the same thing. So thank you for the invitation to also participate here today. Secondly, what this provided me was also to again read America's in the Heart. I had read it some time ago, and I'm glad you forced me to read it again, because it anytime you go over a work of art like this, you find that there's so many things that you miss, and that was a good opportunity for me to put some things together. And as I said in my talk, I personally experienced a lot of the things that Bulosan talked about and experienced personally. The last thing is that actually the first book I ever read of Bulosan was when I was a teenager. and I had read Laughter of My Father, and I loved it. And this was before I even knew about his book in 46, Americas in the Heart. And it's a side of Bulosan, as I think about it, that probably needs to be more popularized and studied, because I think in that book, which was a light-hearted uh, 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 work, I think he had a lot of serious things to say as well. So again, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And so, Andre, do all your closing remarks. I know you have a list of them to do, and then I'll close the webinar.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Jaime. Okay, great. So an acknowledgements, just very briefly, with the slides, please. Many thanks to my family who put up with my hectic schedule and all my myriad demands to try to get everything done. Thanks goes out to my project partners, Jeffrey Cabusao from Bryant University, Mary Lacanlale from FCS and CSU Dominguez Hills, Peter Jamero for his first-hand account of the Bridge Generation, Jaime Geaga from the Carlos Bulosan Book Club. Thank you so much for this collaboration, this one-of-a-kind meeting of minds together to present and pay tribute to our hero. Thank you to my professors, Adrian Childs and Peter Van Zant Lane at the University of Georgia. Much appreciation to Douglas Nehans of Ablaze Records and Kevin Holzman, who leads the brilliant musicians of the Wind Symphony at the University of Cincinnati. Thank you to Pierce Nitta and Joel Crawford for the help with the electronics. Also, much appreciation to Levita Gentile and the members of the estate of Carlos Bulosan for the permission to set our author's words on American democracy. It has been a great honor. This work was supported in part through a micro grant from the Arts Connection, the Arts Council of San Bernardino County. And additional funding was also supplied by the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts and the California Arts Council through the California Relief Fund for Artists and Cultural Practitioners, as well as a generous individual artist fellowship award made possible by Arts Orange County. Thank you, California Humanities, for the generous quick grant and the American Prize National Competition for the support you have given to this work. Much appreciation to Thelma Aranda Sugai, host of Pinay Insight, and the Asian American Press Club of the U.S. Thank you for the moral support. And long live representative democracy in the United States of America. Now, a few words on some commercial materials. If you want to study this further, this work, I sent you all the symbolism and meaning handout. You can also navigate to this address to access it, or the QR code below. Next slide, please. On American Democracy, the full score, parts, and fixed media may be obtainable at Murphy Music Press for any wind ensembles that would like to program it at concert. Next slide. Final slide. I'd like to end with a quote. "We are the mirror of what America is. If America wants us to be living and free, then we must be living and free. If we fail, then America fails," meaning that we individuals, citizens of this nation, must be responsible for the country that we want to be. If we do not take responsibility for that, we leave it up to others, and that may not always be the vision that we want for ourselves and for the future. So please do what's right. Vote for democracy in November 2024. Thank you for tuning in today.
Thank you, Andre. I'd like to make a big shout and big thanks to our audio Zoom tech, Caroline Calderon. This brings our webinar to a close. Everybody have enjoyed the rest of your day. And if the panelists could just stay for a minute or two, if you can, I would appreciate that so much. And we will have everybody, all the guests exit now. Thank you again for attending. And visit our website, Carlos Bulosan Book Club. Has lots of content and events. We do these types of of programming at least once a month for the rest of the year. So visit the Carlos Bulosan Book Club website at your pleasure. Thank you so much.